Thank you, Andy. Throughout our service this evening, I've shared 3 questions about intergenerational teshuvah. Each time, I asked if the individual or individuals in question merited an expectation to repair damage that they themselves had not caused, damage done by their forebears. Likely, you have a question of your own. What exactly is intergenerational teshuvah? In a few minutes, we'll hear the sacred attributes of God chanted aloud. Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum V'Chanun. Adonai, God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in kindness and faithfulness, extending kindness to the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. We read this verse not just on the High Holy Days, but also each week as we take the Torah scroll out of the Ark. And yet, in its original context in Exodus, this verse goes on to say that God does not dispense with all punishment, but rather does actually visit the misdeeds of parents upon children. And as the text says, upon children's children up to the 3rd and 4th generations. And it's not a mistake, the Torah repeats it several times so that we're sure. So what does this mean? Are we accountable for the sins of the past? Does it make a difference if the misdeeds of the past were done by our direct ancestors or if they were done by an entire generation or more that came before us? Are we responsible for things that happened before we were born? Is there or should there be such a thing as intergenerational teshuvah? What's more, can the errors of a previous generation be used as an explanation for the suffering that we experience today? Often that is how the statement is understood, a theology of inherited guilt and justifiable suffering. The Torah is understood to be saying that we are suffering not because of something that we did wrong, but because of something that was done by our parents or our grandparents or even our great-great-grandparents. But how can such a theology bring us closer to God? How can we love a God who punishes us for things that happened before we were born? I've never found this interpretation to be compelling or even plausible. And when we look at the great Jewish thinkers of the past, we find that many of them agree. How can it be just for God to visit the parents' iniquity upon the children? Asks the famous commentator Isaac Abarvanel. In answer, Rashi explains that the concept of visiting the sins of parents upon their children is referring only to situations where the children are repeating their parents' erroneous behavior. It's understandable that if we are perpetuating the wrongs of the past, we would be equally culpable and therefore justifiably punishable. According to Rashi's interpretation, we don't suffer as a punishment for sins of the past if we're not repeating them. And yet, does this mean that we are unaffected by the misdeeds of the past? Are the Verwutz and the Karlbach descendants in the clear if they are not perpetuating racism and sexual harassment? Or do we still expect them to be an explicit voice in the public cries for justice and change? Are the youth of today clear of responsibility for what we have done to our planet? Our initial reaction might be to say, yes, how can it be? They're not guilty. They're not responsible. And yet, according to Jewish tradition, this is not the case. As Rabbi Hertz explains in his well-known commentary, the laws of generational iniquity relates to the consequences of sin. In other words, we are not being punished for the sins of the past because we have somehow inherited a transgenerational form of guilt. Rather, the consequences of the wrongs perpetuated in the past may be so severe that we are still experiencing them today. The daughters of Verwoerd and Karlbach cannot escape their father's sins without changing their names, and even then they could not escape the emotional burdens of knowing what was done. Similarly, the youth of today cannot escape the consequences of climate change. And think of systemic racism. White people today may not have perpetuated the kinds of racist atrocity as did slave owners, white supremacists, or the participants in apartheid. And yet, we who are white have inherited their legacy and the ongoing multi-generational impact of their crimes against humanity. There will always be some who see those horrific acts reflected in white skin, just as there will always be some who will hear the names Verwoerd and Karlbach and cringe, even though the Verwoerd and Karlbachs of today are good people doing good things in the world and trying to rewrite the legacy of their family names. Whether we like it or not, we inherit the sins of the past and we are living out their consequences. Some among us are still unknowingly, unintentionally, or with willful ignorance, perpetuating unconscious racist biases. Others among us are still suffering their effects. In 2009, I joined a delegation of rabbinical students on a trip to Germany, organized by a group called Germany Close Up, which brings American Jews to meet modern Germany. The program aims to encourage German-Jewish dialogue, and according to their website, each program provides a framework for participants to experience and explore contemporary Germany. All programs contain units looking at both the past and the present, to deal with the memory of the Shoah and the Nazi terror, and to conquer the changes, consider the changes in German politics and society over the past decades. It was a fascinating trip, and yet one encounter in particular stands out. Our group of rabbinical students met one morning in Berlin with a group of Christian theological students. We were given the opportunity to ask and answer questions of one another. And while I don't remember all the different conversations we had, I do remember being very moved by their answers to the question of how they live with the history of the German perpetuated genocide during World War II. Their answers basically came down to one clear statement. We do not feel guilty about the Holocaust because we were not alive at that time. We do feel responsible, not for what happened, but for ensuring that something like that never happens again. In the book The Sunflower by Simon Wiesenthal, the question is raised of whether a Jewish prisoner in a concentration camp can or should forgive a dying Nazi soldier. 53 distinguished men and women, theologians, political leaders, writers, human rights activists, and survivors of the Holocaust and other more recent genocides respond to this question. It is felt by many of them that the prisoner has no right to forgive on behalf of the victims. This is where the issues of collective or individual guilt and victimhood must come into play, writes Sven Alkali, a former ambassador of the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The question of forgiveness must be defined in the individual or collective terms, he continues, just as guilt must be defined in individual or collective terms. I explicitly and emphatically reject the idea of collective guilt, he writes, but I do believe that there is such thing as national or state responsibility. Smail Balak, a theologian from Sarajevo, similarly responds that every person is responsible for his or her own actions, and no one is able to absolve the guilt that one person bears toward others. No soul carries the burden of another, he writes. There is no such thing as collective guilt, since collective guilt would point fingers at the innocent as well as the guilty. We may only speak of general culpability if a society tolerates the development of a fundamentally perverted image of man. Mr. Balak is saying the same thing that the German theological students said, and something similar to what Rabbi Hirsch was trying to teach. We are not guilty for the sins of the past. And yet, when the sins of the past are so great that we are still experiencing their consequences today, we are, to an extent, responsible, and we must be held accountable. Not responsible and accountable for the sin itself, but rather responsible and accountable for tikkun, for repair. We cannot bury our heads in the sand. We cannot ignore the consequences still being experienced by ourselves and others. And we cannot stand by if our societies are still perpetuating the sins of the past, even if we ourselves are not. This is what it means to engage in generational teshuvah. It means we are responsible to end racism even if we are not racist. It means we are responsible to fight for an end to gender-based violence and violence perpetuated against individuals because of how they identify or who they love, even if we are not perpetrators of such violence. It means we are responsible to fight climate change, to do our best to repair our broken and damaged planet, even though it was broken and damaged long before we were born. We must be active. We must be educated. We must acknowledge and own the faults that we can't help. We must own the realities and challenges of white privilege and economic privilege and male privilege and heteronormative privilege, even if we do not yet fully understand what is gained by calling out such privileges. We must take responsibility for the actions we take that contribute to climate change, even if we can't rectify each and every one of them immediately. We must commit to do better. We must advocate for policy change and changes in consumerism. We must be willing to make changes in ourselves, in our habits, and to make sacrifices for the greater good. This is how we do intergenerational teshuvah. And let me be clear, it is expected from all of us. It is incumbent upon the Verwutz and the Karlbachs alike. It is incumbent upon parents and children alike. It is incumbent upon me, and it is incumbent upon you. In the Sunflower, we are reminded by Alan Berger, a professor of Jewish and Holocaust studies, that teshuvah, turning away from misdeeds and turning back toward a correct path, is a process rather than a single act. We are not responsible for fixing every broken piece of our world. We are responsible for carrying forward the process of teshuvah and for doing our part, for not turning a blind eye. In Pirkei Avot, we read, Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor velo ata bin chorin lehivatel mimena. You are not responsible to complete the work, and yet neither are you free to desist from it. We are responsible, but we are not alone. We are partners with one another in this repair, and we are partners with God. May each of us lean into this partnership. May each of us accept this responsibility. May each of us take up the call and begin the work. King Yehי Ratzon.